The ground shook under Jinho Park's boots as another explosion lit up the dark sky of Nexus 7. Red plasma bolts streaked overhead, while the screams of dying soldiers mixed with the alien howls of the Vex swarm. The research station Alpha 9 was falling, and everyone knew it. "Move, move, move!" Jinho shouted to the group of civilians huddled behind the broken wall. His rifle felt hot in his hands after hours of constant fighting. The coalition forces were losing this battle badly, and they all knew it. A massive shadow fell across the courtyard as something huge landed with a thunderous crash. Jinho spun around and saw her for the first time. The Catherian warrior stood nearly 9 feet tall with golden fur that gleamed like metal in the firelight. Her claws were longer than human fingers, and her eyes burned with a fierce intelligence that made Jinho's breath catch in his throat. Thexara moved like liquid death as she tore through a pack of Vex hunters that had cornered a group of Zenthari diplomats. Her claws sliced through the biomechanical monsters like they were made of paper. Each movement was perfect and deadly. The other coalition species whispered that Catherians were the ultimate predators in the galaxy, and now Jinho understood. "Why? Human soldier!" Thexara called out in heavily accented Galactic Standard as she approached him. Her voice was deep and rough like grinding stone. "Your evacuation ships leave soon?" 10 minutes, Jinho replied while keeping his weapon ready. Even fighting on the same side, a Catherian warrior this close made his instincts scream danger. "Maybe less if the Vex break through the eastern perimeter." Thexara nodded and turned back toward the fighting. That was when Jinho noticed the 2 small forms pressed against her legs. The cubs were barely knee-high to their mother, but they already had the same golden fur and sharp claws. Their large eyes watched everything with the same fierce intelligence as their parent. The next few minutes passed in a blur of desperate fighting. Thexara carved a path through the Vex swarm that allowed dozens of civilians to reach the landing zone. She moved with such deadly grace that even the hardened coalition Marines stopped to stare. But the enemy kept coming, and there were simply too many of them. A Vex plasma cannon found its target, and Thexara stumbled as superheated energy burned across her back and side. The smell of burned fur and flesh filled the air, but she kept fighting. Another blast caught her in the shoulder, and this time she fell to one knee. "Mother!" one of the cubs cried out in their own language. The sound was like a kitten's mew, but with an edge of desperation that needed no translation. Jinho found himself running toward the fallen warrior without thinking. His medic training kicked in as he dropped beside her and started checking her wounds. The plasma burns covered nearly half her body and went deep into the muscle. Even with their advanced medical technology, these injuries would take weeks to heal properly. "The ships," Thexara gasped, her golden eyes fixed on Jinho's face. "They leave now." 2 minutes, he told her while applying emergency bandages. "We can get you to the medical bay. Our doctors know Catherian physiology." Thexara shook her massive head slowly. "Too late for me." She looked down at her cubs who were pressed against her uninjured side. But not for them. What happened next would stay with Jinho for the rest of his life. The proud Catherian warrior, member of a species that valued strength above all else, looked directly into his eyes and spoke words that went against everything her people believed. "Take them with you." "I don't understand," Jinho said, though part of him was already beginning to grasp what she meant. "My cubs," Thexara continued, her voice getting weaker. "They are too young to survive on Kitharos without me. My people will see them as weak, defective. They will be culled." The word culled hit Jinho like a physical blow. He had heard about Catherian child-rearing practices, but hearing it from a dying mother was different. "Your species," Thexara went on, "raises the weak alongside the strong. I have watched human soldiers care for wounded comrades. I have seen human parents protect cubs that are not even their own blood." She coughed, and golden blood speckled her lips. "Mine does not. The evacuation alarm started blaring across the compound. 1 minute to departure. You want me to take your children? Jinho asked, hardly believing what he was hearing. Promise me, Thexara said, her claws gripping his arm with desperate strength. Promise me you will raise them as your own. Teach them to be strong, but also to be human. Jinho looked down at the two cubs. They stared back at him with those burning golden eyes, not understanding what was happening but sensing their mother's distress. The male cub, Vel, had darker markings around his face, while the female, Nyx, was smaller but had longer claws. Neither of them looked weak to Jinho. They looked terrified. I promise, he heard himself say. Thexara's grip relaxed, and she smiled. For the first time since he had met her, it transformed her fierce face into something almost gentle. Their names are Vel and Nyx. Tell them their mother died with honor. The evacuation ships lifted off just as the eastern perimeter finally collapsed. Jinho sat in the transport's cramped passenger compartment with two alien cubs huddled against him, still not quite believing what had just happened. Around him, the other survivors whispered among themselves. He caught fragments of their conversations. Never seen a Cytherian do that before. Those cubs won't last a week with humans raising them. Poor things. They don't know how soft humans are. Dr. Yuna Lee, the expedition's xenobiologist, leaned across the aisle toward him. Jinho, I have to ask, do you have any idea what you just agreed to? Cytherian cubs are not like human children. They're predators from birth. Jinho looked down at Vel and Nyx, who had fallen asleep against his chest, despite the transport's vibrations. They looked so small and vulnerable that it was hard to imagine them as dangerous predators. I made a promise to their mother, he said, simply. But you know nothing about raising Cytherians, Dr. Lee pressed. Their dietary needs, their social development, their combat training. Everything about their species is built around strength and dominance. Then I'll learn, Jinho replied. The transport shuddered as it entered hyperspace, carrying them away from the burning world below. In his arms, the two cubs stirred restlessly, making small sounds of distress. Instinctively, Jinho began to hum, a lullaby his own mother had sung to him years ago. The cubs settled down at the sound. Dr. Lee shook her head. You're going to get those cubs killed with human softness. But Jinho wasn't listening anymore. He was thinking about Thexara's last words and wondering what it meant to raise alien warriors to be human. As the ship carried them toward an uncertain future, he held the cubs closer and continued humming. Outside the viewports, the stars stretched into lines of light as they jumped toward what he hoped would be safety. He had no idea that this moment would change not just 3 lives, but the future of 2 entire species. 6 months had passed since the evacuation from Nexus 7, and life aboard the Coalition vessel New Hope had settled into a strange routine. Jinho Park stood in his quarters watching Vel and Nyx tear apart their breakfast with enthusiasm that would have horrified most humans. The cubs had grown noticeably in the past months and now stood almost 3 feet tall. Their golden fur had developed the metallic sheen of adult Cytherians, and their claws were sharp enough to cut through standard hull plating. No fighting over food, Jinho said calmly, as Vel tried to snatch a piece of synthesized meat from his sister's portion. There's plenty for both of you. Vel looked up at him with those burning golden eyes that reminded Jinho so much of Thexara. The cub made a sound that was part growl and part question. After months of living together, Jinho had learned to understand basic Cytherian emotional expressions even though he couldn't speak their language fluently. Because fighting wastes energy, Jinho explained while sitting down across from them. And because Nyx is your family, you protect family, not hurt them. This concept still confused the cubs greatly. In Cytherian society, siblings were competitors, first and family second. The stronger cub was expected to dominate the weaker one in everything from food distribution to sleeping arrangements. But Jinho had refused to allow this from the beginning. Nyx finished her meal first and padded over to where Jinho sat. She was smaller than her brother, but quicker and more curious about everything around her. She climbed into his lap with the casual affection that had scandalized the other coalition species when they first witnessed it. Adult Catherians never showed such behavior. "Jinho," she said in her mixture of Catherian and Galactic standard. Her pronunciation was getting better every day. "Why do other Catherians look at us strange?" The question hit Jinho harder than he expected. He had noticed the stares and whispers whenever they encountered other members of Thexara's species aboard the ship. The adult Catherians watched Vel and Nyx with expressions that ranged from confusion to disgust. "Because you're different now," he said honestly. "You've learned things that other Catherian cubs don't learn." "Bad different?" Vel asked, joining them. His vocabulary was smaller than his sister's, but he understood more than he could express. "Different can be good," Jinho replied, though he wondered sometimes if Dr. Yuna Lee had been right about human softness being dangerous for the cubs. The door chimed and Minho Kim entered carrying a data pad. Jinho's friend had become unofficial, uncle to the cubs over the past months, though he still jumped slightly whenever they moved too quickly. Catherian reflexes were far faster than human ones, and even the cubs could be startling. "Daily reports," Minho said, handing over the pad. "Also, Dr. Sujin Han wants to schedule another psychological evaluation for Vel and Nyx." Jinho sighed. The ship's psychologist had been monitoring the cubs' development with growing concern. According to her, they were deviating from normal, Catherian behavioral patterns in ways that could be problematic. "What's her concern this time?" Jinho asked while scanning the reports. "Empathy," Minho replied. "Apparently Nyx was seen comforting a wounded Zenthari child in the medical bay yesterday. Dr. Han says cross-species compassion is completely unknown in Catherian psychology." Jinho remembered the incident. A Zenthari family had been injured in a minor hull breach, and their young daughter had been crying from pain and fear. Nyx had approached the child and began purring softly, the same sound she made when she was content. The little Zenthari had stopped crying and actually smiled. "And that's bad because?" Jinho asked. "Because it goes against millions of years of evolution," came a new voice from the doorway. Kextor, a Catherian military observer, entered without invitation. He was a typical adult of his species, standing over 8 feet tall with battle scars covering his arms and face. His presence made both cubs move closer to Jinho. "Observer Kextor," Jinho said politely, though he disliked the way the alien looked at Vel and Nyx. "What can I do for you?" "You can stop corrupting those cubs," Kextor replied bluntly. "What you call kindness, we call weakness. What you call family bonding, we call failure to establish proper dominance hierarchies." Vel hissed softly, a sound that made Minho take a step backward. Even as a cub, the young Catherian's anger was intimidating. "They're happy and healthy," Jinho said firmly. "They're learning, growing, and developing their own personalities." "Personalities," Kextor repeated the word like it tasted bad. "Cubs do not need personalities. They need strength, aggression, and the will to dominate. You are making them soft. I'm making them complete," Jinho shot back. Kextor's eyes narrowed dangerously. "I have been authorized by the Catherian High Command to monitor these cubs' development. If they become too corrupted by human influence, they will be recalled to Kitharos for proper correction." The word correction sent a chill down Jinho's spine. He had learned enough about Catherian culture to know what that meant. The cubs would be subjected to brutal conditioning designed to strip away everything human about them. "They're not going anywhere," Jinho said quietly. "We shall see," Kextor replied, and left without another word. After the Catherian observer was gone, Nyx looked up at Jinho with worried eyes. He wants to take us away? Not if I can help it, Jinho promised, though he wasn't sure how he could stop an entire species if they decided to reclaim the cubs. The weeks that followed were tense ones. Kextor seemed to be everywhere, watching and taking notes on every interaction between Jinho and the cubs. Dr. Sujin Han increased her psychological evaluations and began asking pointed questions about whether human child-rearing methods were appropriate for alien children. But something wonderful was happening, too. Vel and Nix continued to develop in ways that amazed everyone aboard the ship. When the hydroponics bay suffered damage during an asteroid storm, the cubs immediately volunteered to help with repairs. They worked alongside Taihun Cho, the ship's engineer, with a coordination that left him speechless. "I've never seen anything like it," Taihun told Jinho later. "They didn't compete or fight over who got to help. They actually cooperated. Vel would hold components while Nix made the fine adjustments. When she got tired, they switched roles without argument. Even more remarkable was what happened during a medical emergency. Dr. Yuna Lee had been working for 3 straight days, treating injured refugees, and finally collapsed from exhaustion in her laboratory. Nix found her there and immediately brought water and an emergency ration. But more than that, she stayed with the unconscious doctor, purring softly and maintaining a protective vigil until other medical staff arrived. "The purring actually has therapeutic effects," Dr. Lee explained to Jinho later. "Cytherian vocal frequencies can promote healing and reduce stress in many species. But adult Cytherians only use this ability on their own cubs, and only briefly. I've never heard of one doing it for another species." These incidents were reported to Kextor, who grew increasingly agitated with each one. Jinho could see the alien warrior struggling with concepts that didn't fit into his rigid worldview. "They are becoming something that should not exist," Kextor told him during one of their confrontations. "Cytherians who care for other species. Warriors who choose cooperation over domination. This is not evolution, human. This is contamination." But Jinho was beginning to see it differently. When he watched Vel and Nix play with other refugee children, teaching them games from both Earth and Kitharos, he saw something beautiful. When he saw them comfort frightened adults with patient understanding, he knew they were becoming something their species had never produced before. They were becoming themselves. The crisis came when a new group of refugees arrived, including several wounded adult Cytherians. According to their cultural norms, the adults should have ignored the cubs completely. Cubs were beneath adult notice until they proved themselves in combat. But Vel and Nix rushed to help the injured warriors, offering food, water, and assistance, without being asked. The adult Cytherians were bewildered. Cubs simply did not behave this way. They didn't show compassion to wounded adults. They didn't share resources freely. They certainly didn't treat members of other species as equals deserving of protection and care. Kextor watched all of this with growing horror. That night, he sent a message to his superiors on Kitharos using the ship's long-range communications. Jinho didn't know what the message said, but he could guess from the observer's expression that it wasn't positive. As he tucked Vel and Nix into their sleeping alcove that night, Jinho wondered what the future would bring. The cubs were happy and thriving, but they were also becoming something that challenged the very foundations of their species' identity. "Jinho," Nix whispered in the darkness. "Are we really different?" "Yes," he whispered back. "But different can be wonderful." He hoped he was right. 2 years had passed since that terrible day on Nexus 7, and the changes in Vel and Nix were impossible to ignore. They now stood nearly 5 feet tall with the lean strength of young adult Cytherians. Their golden fur had darkened to the rich amber of their mother's coat, and their claws had grown long and sharp. But anyone who knew them could see they were different from any other Cytherian in the galaxy. Jinho watched from the observation deck as the cubs played with a group of refugee children in the ship's recreation area. The game they had invented combined elements from a dozen different worlds and species. Vel was currently explaining the rules to a confused Arduan child whose tentacles kept getting tangled in the playing equipment. "It's simple," Vel said patiently in fluent Galactic. "Standard. When the light turns red, everyone has to find a partner from a different species. If you can't find one, you sit out until the next round." The Arduan child gurgled something in his native language, and Vel responded in the same tongue. Jinho still couldn't quite believe how quickly the cubs had picked up languages. They were now fluent in 7 different galactic tongues and could make themselves understood in a dozen more. "Remarkable," said Dr. Yuna Lee, joining him at the observation window. "Look at how naturally they adapt to each child's capabilities. They're not just playing, they're teaching social cooperation." Jinho nodded, though he kept his expression neutral. Ever since Kextor had begun filing reports about the cubs' development, every interaction was scrutinized by multiple observers. He had learned to be careful about showing too much pride in what Vel and Nix had become. "Dr. Han wants another evaluation next week," Dr. Lee continued quietly. "She's particularly interested in their response to competitive situations." "They compete fine when it matters," Jinho replied. "They just don't see everything as a competition." This was the heart of the problem as far as other Cytherians were concerned. Vel and Nix had retained all of their species' physical capabilities and fighting instincts, but they had learned to choose when to use them. They could be deadly predators when necessary, but they preferred cooperation to dominance. A commotion in the hydroponics bay interrupted his thoughts. Emergency alarms were blaring, and Jinho could see crew members running toward the agricultural section of the ship. He was about to investigate when he saw Vel and Nix racing past him, moving with the fluid grace that marked them as true Cytherians. By the time Jinho reached the hydroponics bay, he found chaos. A cascade failure in the environmental controls had flooded half the growing chambers, and the automated systems were malfunctioning. Taihun Cho was up to his waist in muddy water trying to manually reset the pumps, while other crew members worked to save what crops they could. But what caught Jinho's attention was the sight of Vel and Nix working together with a precision that left him breathless. They had positioned themselves at opposite ends of the main water distribution manifold and were coordinating their movements with split-second timing. When Vel called out switch, they would simultaneously adjust different valves, managing water pressure and flow with the kind of teamwork that took most species years to develop. How did they know what to do? Taehun gasped as he climbed out of the water. "I didn't have time to explain the system to them." "They watched me work on it last month," Nix replied, not taking her attention off the control panel she was monitoring. "Vel memorized the pressure sequences and I learned the flow patterns." "But how are you coordinating without looking at each other?" Taehun pressed. Vel grinned, showing teeth that could tear through steel plating. "Jinho taught us to listen to our partner's breathing. When you work as a team, you start to move like one person." The repair took 3 hours, and by the end of it, the cubs had saved most of the ship's food supply. Word spread quickly through the vessel about what they had accomplished. For most of the crew, it was just another example of how remarkable Vel and Nix had become. But Jinho noticed Kextor taking detailed notes, and his expression was troubled. The real test came a week later when a distress signal brought them to the aid of a damaged transport carrying Cytherian refugees. The adult warriors who came aboard the New Hope were scarred veterans of the war against the Vex, and they carried themselves with the proud bearing of their species. They also made no effort to hide their disgust when they saw Vel and Nix. "Abominations," one of them muttered in the Cytherian language, apparently not realizing the cubs could understand him perfectly. "Corrupted by alien weakness," agreed another. Jinho tensed, ready to intervene, but Vel and Nix simply continued what they were doing. They had been helping to distribute food and medical supplies to the new refugees, and they kept working despite the insults. Their calm reaction seemed to anger the adult Cytherians even more. Things came to a head when one of the wounded refugees, an elderly Xanthari diplomat named Voxhan, collapsed during the intake process. The old being had been hiding the severity of his injuries and finally succumbed to internal bleeding. Dr. Yuna Lee was busy with other patients, and the nearest medic was 20 minutes away. The adult Catherians simply stepped around the dying Xanthari without stopping. In their culture, showing weakness meant forfeiting the right to help. But Vel and Nyx immediately dropped what they were doing and rushed to Voxhan's side. Working together, they applied pressure to his wounds while Nyx used her purring to slow his heart rate and reduce trauma shock. Vel simultaneously activated the emergency medical beacon and began administering basic first aid. Their movements were so coordinated, it was like watching a single organism with 4 arms. "What are you doing?" demanded one of the adult Catherians. "Let the weak one die with dignity." "He's not weak," Vel replied without looking up from his work. "He's hurt. There's a difference." "You waste resources on inferior species," another warrior snarled. "This is what comes of human contamination." Nyx's response was to increase her purring frequency, which had the effect of calming not just Voxhan, but several other frightened refugees nearby. The sound was so soothing that even some of the adult Catherians stopped their complaints and listened. When Dr. Lee finally arrived, she found Voxhan stable and conscious. "Incredible work," she told the cubs. "You probably saved his life." The elderly Xanthari reached up with one trembling tentacle to touch Nyx's face. "Thank you, young ones," he whispered. "Your mother would be proud." It was the first time anyone had mentioned Thexara in front of the cubs in over a year. Jinho saw their ears twitch at the reference and knew they were thinking about the mother they barely remembered. "Our mother died fighting to save others," Vel said quietly. "Jinho taught us that's what real strength looks like." The adult Catherians exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with this interpretation of their heroic ideal. In their culture, Thexara's sacrifice was honored because she had died in glorious battle, not because she had saved lives. Over the following days, Jinho watched as Vel and Nyx continued to challenge Catherian expectations. They shared their food freely with hungry refugees. They played with alien children who would normally be beneath their notice. They comforted frightened adults and helped injured beings without regard for species or social status. Most shocking of all, they did these things in full view of the adult Catherians, who watched with growing bewilderment and anger. "They have no understanding of proper hierarchy," Kexter complained to Jinho during one of their increasingly frequent confrontations. "They treat a Xanthari diplomat the same as a Catherian warrior. They show compassion to beings who have no claim on their protection. They show compassion because it's right," Jinho replied. "Not because someone has earned it." "That is not the Catherian way. Maybe the Catherian way isn't the only way." Kextor's eyes flashed with dangerous anger. "You speak heresy, human. Our ways have made us the greatest warriors in the galaxy." "And what has that gotten you?" Jinho challenged. "You're losing the war against the Vex. Your birth rates are declining because your culture kills off anyone who shows weakness. Your allies don't trust you because you see them as inferior." "We are superior. Vel and Nyx are Catherian," Jinho said calmly. "And they're stronger than any pure-blood warrior I've met. Not because they can kill better, but because they can choose not to kill. Not because they dominate others, but because they lift others up." The argument was interrupted by shouting from the refugee quarters. Jinho and Kextor ran toward the sound and found a crowd gathered around 2 adult Catherians who were engaged in a dominance fight. The larger warrior had the smaller one pinned and was about to deliver what looked like a potentially fatal blow. Before either Jinho or Kextor could intervene, Vel and Nyx appeared. Moving with the deadly speed of their species, they positioned themselves between the fighters. But instead of joining the battle or trying to physically separate the combatants, they did something that stunned everyone present. They began to sing. The sound that came from their throats was unlike anything Jinho had ever heard from a Catherian. It was the purring frequency that Nyx used for healing, but harmonized with Vel's deeper voice in a complex pattern that seemed to resonate in the bones of everyone listening. The effect was immediate and profound. The fighting Catherians stopped mid-blow and stared at the cubs in amazement. The alarm klaxons shattered the peaceful morning routine aboard the New Hope with their urgent wailing. Jinho bolted upright in his bunk as the ship's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red. The voice of Captain Hyok Kang crackled over the communication system with news that sent ice through every person's veins. All hands to battle stations. Vex swarm detected on long-range sensors. Estimate 15 minutes to contact. This is not a drill. Jinho's training kicked in immediately as he grabbed his combat gear, but his heart clenched when he saw Vel and Nyx standing in their alcove. They had grown to nearly 6 feet tall now, with all the physical presence of young adult Catherians, but they were still his children in every way that mattered. "Get to the evacuation assembly point," he told them while checking his weapons charge. "Stay with the other civilians and follow emergency protocols." "We're not civilians," Vel replied calmly, his voice carrying the deeper tones of maturity. "We're Catherians." "You're 5 years old," Jinho shot back, though he knew that in Catherian terms they were nearly adults. "The evacuation pods are the safest place for you." Nyx moved to stand beside her brother, her golden eyes reflecting the emergency lighting. "Our mother died fighting the Vex. We know what they are capable of." Before Jinho could argue further, the ship shuddered as something massive impacted the hull. Through the observation windows, he could see the nightmare shapes of Vex bioships swarming around the New Hope like predatory insects. Their organic hulls pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Go!" Jinho shouted to the cubs as he ran toward his battle station. "Promise me you'll get to safety!" He didn't wait for their answer because the ship lurched again, and he could hear the sound of hull breaches echoing through the corridors. The New Hope had been designed as a refugee transport, not a warship, and everyone aboard knew they couldn't win a straight fight against a Vex swarm. The battle that followed was desperate from the first moment. Captain Kang used every trick. He knew to keep the ship moving while the gunners tried to thin out the attacking swarm. But there were simply too many Vex ships and not enough weapons to stop them all. Jinho found himself leading a damage control team through the lower decks, sealing breaches and rerouting power systems as the ship took hit after hit. The Vex were using their standard tactic of overwhelming their target with numbers while their bioweapons ate through hull plating like acid through paper. "Bridge to all sections," came Captain Kang's voice over the comm. "We're losing main power and life support is failing. Begin evacuation procedures immediately." The words every spacer dreaded most echoed through the dying ship as emergency lighting flickered and went out. In the darkness, Jinho could hear the sounds of people running, shouting, crying as they tried to reach the escape pods before it was too late. He was helping to evacuate the medical bay when the hull breach alarm sounded. From Section 7. That was where the civilian shelters were located. That was where Vel and Nyx were supposed to be waiting for evacuation. Without thinking, Jinho broke away from his team and ran through the darkened corridors towards Section 7. Emergency power was failing throughout the ship, and he had to navigate by memory and the faint glow of his handheld light. Behind him, he could hear the terrible sounds of the Vex bioweapons cutting through the outer hull. He reached Section 7 just in time to see his worst nightmare coming true. A Vex hunter-killer had broken through the hull and was advancing on a group of trapped civilians. The creature was a masterpiece of biological horror, standing 8 feet tall with razor-sharp claws and adaptive armor that shifted color to match its surroundings. Its multiple eyes tracked movement with predatory intelligence while bioelectric weapons charged along its arms. The civilians cowered against the far wall, unable to escape because debris blocked the other exits. Among them, Jinho could see elderly Zenthari diplomats, injured coalition soldiers, and a handful of children from various species. They were all going to die unless someone stopped the creature. That was when he saw them. Vel and Nix stood between the monster and the helpless. Civilians, their young bodies tense with controlled aggression. They had positioned themselves with the tactical awareness of seasoned warriors, creating overlapping fields of attack while maintaining escape routes. But more importantly, they stood together as a perfect team. "Get back!" Jinho shouted, raising his weapon to target the Vex creature. "No time," Vel called back without taking his eyes off the hunter-killer. "It's already adapting to our heat signatures." The Vex creature moved with liquid speed, its claws extending toward Nix as bioelectric energy crackled along its arms. But the cubs were ready. Nix dropped low and rolled left, while Vel leaped high and right, their movements so synchronized. It was like watching a choreographed dance. What happened next would have impressed veteran Coalition Marines. As the creature turned to track Nix's movement, Vel landed on its back and drove his claws into the neural cluster at the base of its neck. The attack would have killed most organic beings instantly, but Vex bioforms were designed to adapt to damage. The creature's armor began to thicken around the wound, and it reached back to grab Vel with arms that suddenly sprouted additional joints. But Nix was already moving, her claws targeting the creature's legs in a pattern designed to cripple its mobility. When the monster adapted by growing additional support structures, she switched to targeting its sensory organs. "It's learning our attack patterns," she called to her brother. "Switch to Chaos Protocol." Chaos Protocol was something Jinho had never heard before, but watching the cubs execute it was like seeing art in motion. Instead of continuing their coordinated assault, they began attacking in completely random patterns, switching targets and tactics every few seconds. Vel would go for the creature's head, while Nix attacked its feet. Then suddenly, they would both target the same arm before splitting apart again. The Vex Hunter-Killer's adaptive systems couldn't keep up with the constant changes. Every time it began to develop countermeasures for one attack pattern, the cubs switched to something completely different. Within minutes, the creature was covered in wounds and stumbling from the constant assault. But the most remarkable thing wasn't their fighting skill. It was why they were fighting. "Stay back!" Nix shouted to the civilians without taking her attention off the creature. "We'll protect you! Protect the young ones first," Vel added as he dodged another swipe from the monster's claws. These were concepts that should have been alien to Catherian thinking. Protecting the weak instead of letting them be culled, putting the safety of other species above their own survival, fighting not for dominance or glory, but for the simple reason that others needed protection. The battle ended when Sergeant Woo-Sung Lee arrived with a squad of Coalition Marines. Their heavy weapons finished off the wounded Vex creature in seconds. But by then, everyone present had witnessed something unprecedented in galactic history. 2 young Catherians had risked their lives to save members of other species, using tactics that combined their natural predatory instincts with learned concepts of cooperation and sacrifice. "How did you know to use Chaos Protocol?" Sergeant Lee asked as medics checked the cubs for injuries. "We made it up," Vel replied with a slight grin that showed his fangs. "Jinho taught us that the best way to win is to be unpredictable." "And to fight for something bigger than yourself," Nix added, gently helping an injured Xanthari child to her feet. Jinho watched this interaction with a mixture of pride and fear. Pride, because Vel and Nix had become everything he had hoped they could be. Fear, because he knew that word of this incident would reach Catherian High Command within days. Sure enough, when the surviving refugees were transferred to a coalition rescue ship 3 days later, Kextor approached Jinho with an expression of barely controlled fury. "This ends now," the Catherian observer said through clenched teeth. "I have sent a full report to the War Council. Those cubs have been completely corrupted by human weakness and must be recalled for correction before they contaminate others." "They saved lives," Jinho protested. "They showed courage and skill that would make any warrior proud." "They showed compassion for inferior species," Kextor snarled. They risked valuable Cytherian lives for beings that should have been allowed to. Die! This is the ultimate perversion of our nature. Looking across the crowded refugee ship, Jinho could see Vel and Nyx helping to distribute supplies and comfort frightened children. They moved among the survivors like natural leaders, offering strength to the weak and hope to the desperate. Other Cytherians watched them with expressions ranging from confusion to horror. A Cytherian warship will intercept us at Kepler Station, Kextor continued. The cubs will be taken home for proper conditioning. When we are finished with them, they will be true Cytherians again. And if I refuse to hand them over? Kextor's smile was cold and predatory. Then you will learn why our species rules through strength. That night, as the rescue ship carried them toward an uncertain future, Jinho sat with Vel and Nyx in their shared quarters and told them what was coming. They listened without interruption, their golden eyes reflecting the starlight. From the observation port, "Will you fight for us?" Nyx asked quietly when he finished. Kepler Station hung in space like a massive metal flower, its rotating sections glittering with the lights of 1,000 different worlds. Under normal circumstances, Jinho would have appreciated the beauty of humanity's greatest diplomatic achievement. But today, all he could see was the sleek black shape of the Cytherian warship Bloodfang docked at the station's military berth. The rescue transport Mercy's Dawn settled into its assigned dock with mechanical precision. But Jinho could feel the tension radiating from every passenger. Word had spread quickly about what was waiting for them. The Cytherian High Command had sent their most decorated war prime to personally retrieve Vel and Nyx. "Remember what I taught you," Jinho whispered to the cubs as they prepared to disembark. They stood nearly as tall as he did now, their golden, fur gleaming with the metallic sheen of adult Cytherians. But their eyes still held the warmth and compassion he had nurtured in them over the past 5 years. "We remember everything," Vel replied quietly. "Every lesson, every story, every moment of kindness you showed us." "You made us who we are," Nyx added, her voice steady despite the fear Jinho could smell in her scent. "Whatever happens, we are proud to be your children." The docking bay was filled with coalition officials, refugee aid workers, and media representatives from a dozen worlds. But all attention focused on the group of Cytherians who stood near the airlock to their warship. At their head was a figure that made even Jinho's experienced combat instincts scream warnings. War Prime Thokmas was everything terrifying about the Cytherian species made manifest. Standing nearly 10 feet tall with battle scars covering his arms and face, he radiated the kind of deadly authority that came from decades of conquest. His golden fur had darkened to deep amber with age, and his claws were longer than human fingers. When he moved, lesser beings stepped aside instinctively. "Human. Jinho Park," Thokmas said in a voice like grinding stone. His galactic standard was perfect but heavily accented. "You will surrender the cubs Vel and Nyx to Cytherian custody immediately." "No," Jinho replied simply. The word echoed through the docking bay like a gunshot. Conversations stopped, and everyone turned to stare at the human who had just defied the most powerful warrior in known space. Thokmas tilted his massive head slightly as if he hadn't heard correctly. "You refuse a direct command from the Cytherian High Command?" "I refuse to hand over my children to people who want to hurt them," Jinho clarified, stepping forward so that he stood between the War Prime and the cubs. "They are not your children," Thokmas snarled, his claws extending slightly. "They are Cytherian property, corrupted by your soft human influence and in need of correction." "We're not property," Vel said, moving to stand beside Jinho. "And we're not corrupted." "We're exactly what our mother wanted us to become," Nyx added, taking position on Jinho's other side. Thokmas stared at the cubs with undisguised disgust. "Look at them, standing with an alien as if he were their blood, showing loyalty to a species they should dominate. This is the result of human contamination." "This is the result of human love," came a new voice from the crowd. Dr. Yuna Lee stepped forward, followed by Captain Hyok Kang, Minho Kim, and dozens of other coalition personnel who had served with Jinho and the Cubs over the years. "You cannot interfere in internal Catherian affairs," Thokmas warned, but his voice carried less certainty than before. "These Cubs are coalition citizens," Captain Kang replied firmly. "They were born on a coalition world and raised by a coalition. Officer, we have jurisdiction here. They are Catherian by blood." "Blood doesn't make family," said Admiral Sung-Hoon Park as he approached through the crowd. Jinho's uncle moved with the quiet authority of someone who had spent his life commanding. Respect rather than demanding it. "These Cubs have been shaped by human values and human love. They are what they choose to be." Thokmas looked around the docking bay, clearly surprised by the level of support for Jinho's position. In Catherian culture, might made right and few. Beings would dare oppose a war prime's will. "Very well," Thokmas said finally. "If you will not surrender them willingly, I invoke the right of combat. I challenge Jinho Park to single combat for custody of the Cubs." A collective gasp went up from the assembled crowd. Everyone knew this was essentially a death sentence for Jinho. No human had ever defeated a Catherian war prime in personal combat. "I accept," Jinho said without hesitation. "No," Vel stepped forward, his young voice carrying clearly across the bay. "If you want to fight for us, you fight all of us." "That is not how the right of combat works," Thokmas replied dismissively. Then, "Maybe it's time for new rules," Nick said, joining her brother. "You taught our species that strength determines worth, but you never learned what we did from humans. That shared strength is greater than individual power." Thokmas stared at the Cubs with something approaching fascination. "You would fight beside this human? Against your own kind?" "He is our kind," Vel replied. "He's our father, our teacher, our pack leader. We fight together or not at all." "This is unprecedented," Kextor protested from among the Catherian delegation. "Cubs cannot participate in a rite of combat." "We're not Cubs anymore," Nick said calmly. "We're Catherians who choose to be human." The philosophical implications of that statement rippled through the crowd like a shock wave. The idea that someone could choose their identity rather than be bound by birth was revolutionary to most of the galaxy's species. Thokmas considered this for a long moment, his scarred face unreadable. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Very well. If they wish to share their guardian's fate, they may do so. But know this, human. When I defeat you, I will take them anyway, and their defiance will make their correction all the more severe." The combat arena was hastily set up in one of the station's cargo bays, with representatives from every major species gathering to witness what many believed would be a massacre. Jinho checked his weapons one final time while Vel and Nix stretched and prepared, themselves with the fluid grace of their species. "You taught us that the best way to win is to be unpredictable," Vel reminded him as they entered the arena. "And to fight for something bigger than yourself," Nix added. "Remember the Chaos Protocol," Jinho said quietly. "Stay fluid, adapt constantly, and never let him predict your next move." Thokmas entered the arena alone, as tradition demanded. His massive form cast long shadows under the harsh combat lighting, and his claws gleamed like polished metal. He looked at his three opponents with the confidence of someone who had never known defeat. "Last chance," he called across the arena. "Surrender now, and I will make their correction swift." "Counteroffer," Jinho replied. "When we win, you acknowledge that there are many ways to be strong." Thokmas laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Begin!" What followed was unlike any combat in recorded galactic history. Thokmas was everything a Catherian war prime should be: faster, stronger, and more skilled than any normal being had a right to be. His claws could cut through hull plating, and his reflexes were so quick that he seemed to anticipate his opponent's moves before they made them. But Jinho, Vel, and Nyx fought as something that had never existed before, a perfect hybrid of human tactical thinking and Catherian physical prowess. They moved as one organism with three bodies, covering each other's weaknesses while amplifying each other's strengths. When Thokmas targeted Jinho's human limitations, Vel and Nyx were there to intercept. When he tried to use his superior reach against the Cubs, Jinho's weapon provided covering fire. Most importantly, they never fell into a predictable pattern. Every time the War Prime began to adapt to their tactics, they switched to something completely different. Impossible, Kextor breathed from the observation deck. He's fighting three opponents simultaneously and they're matching him. The turning point came when Thokmas finally managed to corner Jinho and raised his claws for a killing blow. But instead of trying to escape, Jinho did something that violated every principle of Catherian combat. He threw down his weapon and opened his arms in a gesture of complete vulnerability. "This is what you call weakness," he called out to Thokmas. "A human protecting his children even unto death." The War Prime hesitated, his warrior's mind struggling to process this unprecedented act of sacrifice. In that moment of confusion, Vel and Nyx struck with coordinated precision, their claws finding the neural pressure points that would disable rather than kill. Thokmas collapsed to his knees, paralyzed but conscious. The arena fell completely, silent as the implications of what had just happened sank in. A human and two corrupted Catherian cubs had defeated the greatest warrior their species had ever produced. "How?" Thokmas gasped, his voice filled with wonder rather than anger. "Because you fought alone," Vel said gently, helping the fallen War Prime sit upright. "And we fought as family." "Because you saw this as a battle to be won," Nyx added. "And we saw it as people to be protected." "Because strength without love is just destruction," Jinho concluded, kneeling beside the defeated warrior. "And love without strength is just hope. But together, they can change the galaxy." Thokmas stared at them for a long moment, his scarred face cycling through emotions that Catherians weren't supposed to feel. Finally, he spoke in a voice thick with something that might have been tears. "You did not make them weak, human.